Hey everyone, today I'm going to be continuing my look at aerobatics in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I'm going to be trying my hand at near vertical takeoffs, hammerhead turns, and I'm going to wrap it all up with a run and brake landing. If you haven't watched my previous video on aerobatics, I highly recommend you start with that one because I cover a lot of details that I won't be looking at again with regards to how to fly the Extra 330. A lot of the maneuvers I'm going to look at today also build upon the maneuvers that I looked at in that first video, so having that knowledge might come in useful. Similar to last time, I'm going to break down each maneuver first to give you an idea of what you're supposed to be doing, and then I'll perform the maneuver a few times just to give you an idea of what it looks like. I'll probably use slew mode this time to explain how to do the maneuver since it'll be a little bit more interactive than just explaining it to you. I'll also cover what you'd be evaluated on if you were doing this maneuver in an air show. Before I get to all the cool aerobatics maneuvers, if you do get any value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. And if you have any comments or you want to critique my flying technique, feel free to put a comment down below. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get airborne. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to be looking at is a near vertical takeoff. Aerobatics is all about balance, and a near vertical takeoff is a maneuver that trades airspeed for altitude. I couldn't find any instructions online on specifically how to do the near vertical takeoff, so this is my interpretation from watching a bunch of videos from military aircraft, commercial airliners, and smaller aircrafts like the Extra 330 that have done near vertical takeoffs at air shows. I'm going to switch into slew mode now to explain the maneuver. I've mentioned it in a previous video that takeoff in this aircraft can be a little bit tricky. What I like to do is I use about 60% power to get up to rotation speed of the aircraft, which is at around 65 knots. Once I've gotten up to that 65 knots and I can get airborne, what I'm going to do is then I'll apply full power to the aircraft. I'm going to try and stay pretty low to the ground, probably within 50 to 100 feet of the ground, while I let the airspeed build up and I keep going down the length of the runway. I'm going to try and hold the runway heading as straight as possible, which isn't always easy, obviously, if there's wind, until I reach my top end of my airspeed, which is in this aircraft around 160 knots. Once I get to 160 knots, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a 2 to 3 G pull all the way up to 60 degrees pitch up attitude. So the airplane is going to end up looking a little bit like this. I'm going to hold that 60 degrees attitude as the airplane continues to ascend, and I'm going to keep an eye on my airspeed. It's alright for the airspeed to drop, obviously. Even at full power at that high of a pitch angle, you're going to lose airspeed rather quickly, but in that time, you're going to have gained probably somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 feet, depending on how well you did the maneuver. Once the airplane is somewhere around 80 to 90 knots, that's where I'm going to start to bring the nose back down to straight and level flight. I couldn't find specific evaluation criteria for this maneuver, but if I was the one doing it, I would be looking for a very neat quarter turn when you're initially starting your ascent. So that's why you want to make sure to have around a 2 to 3 G pull to keep it nice and constant the whole way up to your 60 degrees pitch up attitude. The other criteria that I would use as well to evaluate it would be that you keep on the same heading that you were at the start of your ascent as at the end once you come back to straight and level flight. Alright, I'm going to reset the flight and I will give that one a go. Alright, everything is set and ready to go. I'm just going to disengage the parking brake and I'm going to get moving. So just as usual, what I like to do for this airplane is do the first part of the takeoff until I'm in the air from the external camera. I apply 60% of full power and I try and keep the airplane as straight as possible. It's very finicky because it's a very light aircraft. Once I get to around 60 knots, I pull up right there, and I'm going to try and stay around 50 to 100 feet above the ground. Ideally, this runway would be a little bit longer because you can see those trees are coming up pretty fast, But our airspeed's building up a fair bit now, and I'll be able to start my climb right now. So I'm just going to pull somewhere between 2.5 to 3G all the way up to 60 degrees nose up attitude, and I'm going to hold it there. Once I go past 80 knots, that's when I start pushing my nose back down, and I try and get the straight and level flight. I overshot it a little bit there, and my heading's a little bit off. But otherwise, I think it went fairly well. That maneuver was worth about 1,500 feet in the space of, about 10 seconds of vertical ascent. So that's all there really is to the near vertical takeoff. Let's move on to our next maneuver, which is going to be Hammerhead Turns. The Hammerhead Turn has a cool name, but it's honestly the most difficult of the maneuvers that I've tried so far. I'm still not great at it, but I still succeed in performing it more often than not. You start the Hammerhead Turn by applying full power and letting your airspeed build up. I've been using the top end of the cruise speed for the aircraft as my marker for when to start the maneuver, so that's again around 160 knots. Once I reach that cruise speed, what I'm going to do is start a 3 to 4G quarter turn up to completely vertical. Once you're vertical, you're going to release the pressure on the elevator, so you want to recenter the stick. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. The airplane's going to have a tendency to want to roll to the right and fall back on itself. So to counteract that, you need to apply a little bit of right rudder and right aileron to keep yourself at a 90-degree angle. So to get completely vertical, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the Aerobatics sight off on the right here. It's a lot easier to tell once you're in a 90-degree straight up attitude than trying to use the attitude indicator. Once the airspeed drops to around 40 knots, that's when I'm going to apply full left rudder to initiate the pivot. So in the Hammerhead, you're going straight up. You use full left rudder to turn the aircraft pretty much right on itself to point straight down. I can't simulate the pivot in slew mode, but imagine that I am literally turning the airplane pretty much almost on a dime in place until it's nose down, using nothing else but the rudder. Once you're pointing downwards again, you're going to have to use a little bit of opposite aileron and a slight forward pressure on the stick so that you maintain that straight nose down descent. When the plane's pointing straight down, you're going to see there's going to be this tendency for the plane to have a pendulum effect. What you're going to do to avoid the pendulum effect is use a little bit of opposite rudder once you've completed the pivot. So you complete the pivot with full left rudder, and then once you're pointing straight down, you quickly apply a full right rudder, and then you recenter the rudder. Once your airspeed builds up to a sufficient level, that's where you can start another quarter turn back to straight and level around 2 to 3.5 G. It's really easy to screw this maneuver up and end up in a spin. So the moment you see that you've screwed something up in the maneuver, and this pretty much applies to any other aerobatic maneuver you're going to do, is you're going to want to center the controls and give the airplane a couple of seconds to stabilize. The airplane's nose is naturally going to point down once the airplane starts to restabilize, and that's where you can reduce your power a little bit, let the airplane continue to stabilize, and then pull it back up to straight and level flight. Alright, I'm just going to restabilize the aircraft, and then I'm going to try a few Hammerhead turns. Alright, you're going to see everything happens really quickly with the Hammerhead, so I'll do my best with the explanation to keep up. So I'm going to start my pull up now. I'm going to use the sights until I see that they are showing that I am completely vertical. I release the pressure on the stick, I hold the airplane in position with the right aileron and rudder. Now I do the pivot with full left rudder, and then I apply a quick amount of right rudder to avoid that pendulum effect. And now I'm just going to pull out of the Hammerhead turn, and there we go. How did that go? So my heading is pretty much what I want it to be, so it's the exact opposite of what it was when I went into the Hammerhead turn. My airspeed is alright because I reduced power near the end, so I think that was pretty successful. Before moving on, I do want to show you the recovery technique I was talking about in the theory section. So I'm just starting another hammerhead turn here, and I'm going to screw up right here, and the airplane's gonna get all out of sorts, and now I have no idea where I'm pointing, and the airplane ends up in quite the spin. So all I do here is I've centered the controls, and I'm just letting the airplane rebuild its airspeed as it's spinning all the way down to the ground, and eventually the airspeed builds up enough that the airplane can fly again, and I slowly pull out of it as much as possible. I'm gonna wrap up by doing a landing technique that's called the run and brake. You've probably seen this technique done at air shows as well, because it's fairly common for military aircraft to use it. The point of the run and brake is to keep a very high airspeed all the way up to the point where you reach the airport's runway. The reason for that, of course, is that a military aircraft is probably dodging rockets and potential fire, so they need to keep their airspeed up as long as possible and fly slowly as little as possible. So what I do to perform this maneuver is I offset myself a little bit from the runway. You can see the runway ahead is just off to the left. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself down to around 500 feet, and I'm going to stay at 500 feet above the ground all the way up to the midway point of the runway. I'm going to be at the top end of my cruise speed to do this maneuver as well. Once I reach the midway point of the runway, that's where I'm going to do the brake part of the maneuver. So what I'm going to do is very quickly I'm going to reduce power, but more importantly what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a 2 to 3G high bank angle turn all the way around until I've joined the traffic pattern on the downwind leg. By having reduced power and doing a very steep angle turn with a slight ascent, what's going to happen is you're going to lose a lot of airspeed really quickly. And that's exactly what we want. From there, what I'm going to do is just continue my descent and continue monitoring my airspeed, getting closer and closer to my final landing airspeed, which in this airplane's at around 60 to 65 knots. I'm gonna fly outbound a little bit on the downwind, just like with a regular landing, and because I'm much closer to the runway than a normal traffic pattern, I'm going to make a very high bank turn once again to turn straight onto final. It can be really tricky to do this part because you're not flying fast and you're doing a high bank angle turn, so you have to be very mindful of your airspeed not to stall. Once I'm on final, I should probably be a few hundred feet above the ground, and then I just do a normal landing and I just come straight in, and once I reach the runway I touch down and come to a complete stop. As you're going to see, landing in this aircraft is a little tricky as well. It has a tendency to bounce, so the slower you can be to do your landing, the better. Alright, let's give this last maneuver a go. Okay, so I am on approach to the runway. I am on my runway heading. I'm offset just a little bit to the right. I'm at the top end of my cruise airspeed just as usual, and I'm around 500 feet above the ground, so I'm perfectly set up for the run and brake. So I'm just going to continue flying until I reach the midway point of the runway, which is when I'm going to start the rest of the maneuver. So to do that, it's usually easiest just to have a look off to the left, and once you see that you're at the midway point, which is right around there, you turn into it around 45-degree bank angle and you start a very tight 2 to 3G turn until you're on the downwind leg while reducing the power. So right there, I'm over the runway. I'm just going to line myself up on the downwind. There we go. And you can see my airspeed went from close to 150, 160, that it's now down to 100 knots. And I'm going to continue reducing power. I want to try and get as close as I can to my landing airspeed because this aircraft is really twitchy to land, just like it is on takeoff. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of extra space to make that last turn, and now I'm going to start my combined base and final turn. And once I've completed this turn, I'm going to be lined up with the runway. So I'm keeping an eye on my airspeed, which is getting a little low, but the airspeed indicator's trend line is pretty much stable, so I think I'm all right there. And now I just have to align myself with the runway a little bit better. My airspeed's still a little high. I need to get that down a little bit more before touching down. Otherwise, I'm looking good for the landing. And all I've got to do is just fly it down like a normal landing, and you're going to see it's really hard to get the plane down on the first try. I usually end up bouncing once. There we go. I had one bounce, so it wasn't too bad. I've had a few landings with this airplane where it was close to 3 or 4 bounces. So overall, this one went pretty well. In terms of the run and brake maneuver, I think it went fairly well as well. I managed to lose a lot of airspeed on that turn, and I think it would have looked pretty good from the ground as well. So that's all I wanted to cover today. If you have any questions or comments, please make sure to put them in the comment box below. And otherwise, make sure to hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.